Hi, I'm Urmi and John, editor here at Move Smartly, and today's episode is The Situation. This is where my co-host John of Realosophy Realty here in Toronto takes a closer look at the detailed consumer questions that he gets every week. So we've got some good ones. Are you ready to get started, John?
Ready to roll, and I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone who sends us their questions every month. I mean, this is probably one of my favorite segments, I think, on our channel, both our podcast and YouTube, because it's about real life situations. I mean, it's quite frankly why I got into the business however many years ago. To help people kind of answer some of these trickier questions when it comes to their real estate decisions. I mean, just buying and selling homes is obviously one part of it, but these questions, I think, are the bigger consideration. So this month, actually, before we kind of get to our questions, I thought I'd kind of unpack one situation that came up when myself and one of our agents met with a prospective client recently who's looking at buying a condominium, because I thought it was a very interesting situation. So he was looking at buying a condo because his landlord is selling his condo and he anticipates getting notice to get kicked out. And thought, he has $300,000 saved. He has a pretty good income. He said, well, why doesn't he just rent a condo or buy a condominium to move into rather than to rent? Now, the one thing that came up during our consultation was that he may be moving from Toronto 2 years from now. His partner is still in school, and when they finish, she'll be getting a job somewhere outside of Toronto. So there's a good possibility they may have to leave. And his thinking was, well, even if that happens in 2 years, he'll just, refinance or pull some money out of the condominium that he bought and just rent it out and buy elsewhere. Now, when we looked at that a little bit more closely, one of the challenges is, and I think this is one of the assumptions some people make, is that if you, put $300,000 down on a $900,000 condo, when you move out of the city to buy another property, you can't just take out $300,000. You need to keep some equity in it. You would need to keep maybe a couple $100,000, which means you'd only be able to potentially to pull out $100,000 for his next home. And on top of that, the debt he has on the condo may constrain what he can buy or limit what he can buy in sort of the next city. And he said he would like to buy, if they move to another city, they'd like to buy a detached home. Now, I think a couple of important things we talked about with him was that if he buys a condo today, certainly there's a possibility that it increases in price significantly, and in 2 years he sells it. But we don't recommend that strategy. When you're buying a property, you want to hold on to it for at least 5 years to make sure that the price increases enough to cover your transaction costs. So in his situation, the concern was that if it didn't go up and he needed to keep it, then that decision might limit what options he has if he wants to buy sort of a detached family-sized home in the next city that he's going to move into. So we kind of weighed the pros and cons of all the different options. And ultimately, he decided buying wasn't the right strategy. And I think that is the right decision, quite frankly. Again, I don't, tell people what to do. But in his situation, after we discussed it, buying a condo today, again, like assuming prices don't take off in 2 years. I mean, if they do, obviously he'd be making money, but there's a good chance they may not, and he may need to keep it. And again, that decision would have limited his ability to buy a family-sized home with him and his partner 2 years from now. So, it's important to remember that sometimes we see prices exploding. We think, we should always buy real estate. But it's important to remember that the decisions we make today may limit some of our options tomorrow, especially if we're thinking we don't want to hold on to real estate for the long term. So, that was a good example of, a client who we didn't, suggest they not buy, but we kind of nudged them and kind of, gave him some of the scenarios that he hadn't considered that might impact him when he moves moving to another city. So now he's working with one of our agents to find a rental instead.
Okay, so a great example of how these situations are very, very personal, and it's about understanding all the moving parts so that you can offer the best advice for the situation. And quickly, John, the reason why you can't pull out all the equity that you've put in, you can't pull out all of the money in a property is because generally banks will look to only allow you to pull out a certain percentage.
Well, you need to have at least 20% of your own cash in that property, right? So if we just use a simple, say it's like a $900,000 condo, which is roughly what he was looking at. When he moves out of it, depending on what the value is, if it's gone up, he needs to have even more, but he needs to have about at least 20% saved in that property. But again, the other important thing is that even if he has 20% saved, you'd have a $700,000 mortgage, just as an example. That mortgage may limit what he could buy when he moves out of the city as well. So not only can he not take out all his capital, he can only take out $100,000 because he has to keep 200 in the condo. But that extra $700,000 mortgage on the condo may limit what he could borrow on his next home, because the bank's going to look at your total debt. And yes, even though he's getting rental income, the rental income's not enough to cover the expenses, and they look at everything collectively. It may limit what he could borrow on his next home purchase. And again, that to me, that's the more important one. I mean, it's the long-term home. It's the one that he wants to be in for the long term. So you don't want to be in a situation where you can't buy that 10-year home because of this condo investment decision you made 2 years ago that turns out wasn't the best move, right? And that's what we're trying to mitigate in that situation.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. All right. Now we'll get to some of the written questions that have been coming in. Hi, John. First of all, thank you so much for giving so much valuable information and being the voice of reason on social media. I watch you on YouTube and I've learned a lot. I keep watching in the hopes that a situation similar to mine is discussed that would help me make an informed decision. So saying that, I would like to ask you my question as you encourage your viewers to ask. My husband and I are in our early 60s and both retired for the past 7 years. We own a 2-bedroom condo townhouse in Southwest Oakville that is mortgage-free and maintenance fees are only $150. Recently, we went to our financial advisor to check the status of our stock portfolio, and even though it has gone down, we are sitting at approximately $1 million. My husband and I receive a pension from that portfolio monthly. Recently, we put our townhouse up for sale and had an offer night. The only reason to put our house up for sale was because we thought it would be a good time to pull our money from the home and downsize into a condo apartment. Our home was put up for sale just after the March break. Unfortunately, we were looking for $1,250,000 for our home, and the highest bid we got was $1,200,000. We decided not to take it based on what our type of home sold for last year. And knowing that it was not the same market as last year, our type of home sold for $1,500,000 at the peak. If we downsize now at current prices, we will surely come up with some extra cash, which we would invest in something safe. But the question is now a good time to move if we don't have to? In fact, if we move, we will be incurring higher maintenance fees than we're currently paying. But given we'll be downsizing to a smaller condo, we will be left with extra cash, about $200,000 to $300,000, which is a good thing during a recession. I would appreciate your professional input. And if you think my situation could be of help to some of your viewers, please feel free to share. Thank you so much, Maria.
That's a very good question. And I think there's actually a number of things to think about with that one. So, I mean, the first question is, is this the right time to sell and to downsize, right? And not to dodge the question, but it's never a good time to sell real estate, apparently, in the Toronto area, right? I mean, if the question is, will my townhome be worth more a year or 2 or 3 years from now? I mean, the answer is probably, right? And we can't time that perfectly. I mean, I think most economists today are not expecting, a disastrous decline in the market. I mean, we're seeing prices increase unbelievably in 2023. So yeah, the most likely scenario is that the condo townhome will be worth more a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, all else equal. I mean, gradually over time, and we're not talking about rapid growth. So but the flip sides to that coin is that, I mean, if you're downsizing and buying a condo apartment, Well, in theory, that one should also be gradually trending up with the market as well. Perhaps maybe not at the same rate, but at a similar rate. So it's not like you're losing money if you sell your townhome today and it's worth more a year from now, because your condo apartment will be worth more as well, right? So you're still invested in the housing market. So I think, I mean, from my perspective, you know, the more important question is just like when you're trying to make these decisions, it's just more of a lifestyle decision. Like, when's the right time to downsize? You know what I mean? When's the right time to sell the townhome and move to the condo apartment, for personal reasons? It's not always just financial, because the financial is unpredictable. And like I said, yes, it'll in theory always go up, or not always go up, but generally the path in the GTA has been positive. But again, you're selling the townhome and investing in the condo apartment. So I personally wouldn't worry as much about that. I think, in terms of like, is now the right time? And again, I think for a lot of people, Maria's looking at what her townhome was selling for at the peak, which was close to 1.5, and now it's only 1.25. And the thing is, well, will it go up to 1.5 again? I mean, it's very hard to say how long that might take. And certainly I should qualify to say that we're seeing a little bit more upward pressure on sort of low-rise homes rather than condos. But again, I think I wouldn't worry so much about that. I think it's more of a personal decision. I mean, I think you make that move when you decide you want to downsize. Now, the other thing that wasn't mentioned, I think, and which is a tricky one for anyone who's downsizing and anyone who's looking at making a move like this, is what do you do first? Do you buy and then sell? Okay. And especially for someone downsizing, because in this situation, I think she said her townhome's worth about 1.25, but the condo apartment they're going to buy is probably worth, say, 900, which would leave them maybe a few $100,000. Well, if you buy first and then sell your townhome, that whole process has to happen very quickly. You don't have a ton of time to prepare your townhome, to get it on the market, because you basically, if you're buying your condo apartment and you have a 3-month closing, you have to sell your current townhome within like a month or two, right? Because they would need that money to afford their condo apartment, right? And I think these are the trickier situations of the timing of these things, and making sure that you're doing that not during a period where the housing market is slowing down. If we roll back the clock to last year, a lot of the people who got impacted by the turn in the market is because they bought first, and then when they go list their current home, the market had slowed down and they didn't get the price that they were expecting, right? And I think this is a concern that people who are downsizing in particular need to be worried about, because if she sells during a period where the market slows down, because like it can, maybe it's not even 1.25 that she's going to get, or 1.2, maybe it's 1.15, right? And again, I think just timing those decisions are very important. And for some of the downsizers I work with, it's not even an option to buy first and then sell. It's like they sell their current home, move to a rental for a year or two, and then find the apartment or whatever they want to move to, because they don't want to be exposed to this risk of, effectively being tied to 2 properties at once, even for a short period, because they're worried about what happens in the market. So I think those are some of the considerations I'd be looking at.
Great. So hopefully that helps Maria. We'll go on to our next question. Hi, John. I've been tinkering around with some numbers, and I'm wondering what to do when rental prices for 1-bedroom and even studios have been increasing to such a dramatic degree that they're starting to become comparable to a monthly mortgage payment. This is assuming that I pay a 20% down payment on a $500,000 property, and I get a mortgage at 4.5%. The thing is, I really value my flexibility and liquidity, and I don't like the idea of parting with over 50% of my savings to finance a down payment, which is why I have not bought in this market in Toronto. However, the idea of paying over $2,000 a month to rent a studio or a junior 1-bedroom is also really bizarre to me, as someone who has grown up in purpose-built rentals all my life, which tend to be less expensive. I'm just wondering if this rapid financialization of the rental market means that it is just better to prioritize saving up for a 20% down payment to have a place where the monthly costs may be more steady than a rental, or if it still makes more sense to look at rentals and try to claim 20 to 30% of the rent on my taxes, which I can do as a work from home employee. I can only live in Toronto proper. I don't have a car and don't know how to drive, so many parts of the GTA are pretty much out of the question. What does your data say about where prices are going for these two scenarios? Does it depend on the neighborhood? If I see a property that is at $430,000 in a popular downtown area, such as Kensington, Chinatown, which I saw earlier with the Village on Grain apartments, should I be opportunistic? Thank you for your insights. Sincerely, Natasha.
Another great question. Again, I think this is a very difficult tension, this should I buy or should I rent? And if we go back to sort of the first situation I talked about with the client who reached out to us, to me, the most important consideration is if you're considering buying, is this the type of property that you want to own for the long term? Ideally live in, and I say long-term, at least 5 years, if not a little bit longer, right? And I say ideally live in, because that's what, most people are doing. But, even if you're not living it and you're renting it, would moving out and renting it limit your decisions in the future? You know what I mean? If you wanted to buy a home with someone else down the road. In the case of our first example, if remember, it would have constrained that person's decisions in the future. So the first is, do you want to live in there long term? And can you hold it long term is probably the more important point. Secondly, I think this idea of parting with your capital, I think it's a personal decision. At the end of the day, your capital is still invested. You know what I mean? Some people just like to see the cash in the bank account and it makes them feel secure, which I kind of relates to. But again, I think it is the flip sides to that is, as she mentioned, you're spending $2,000 plus per month in rent, for a studio or a junior one bedroom, which is also not great. So, it's a personal question. If the decision is to rent, I think my advice would be certainly to turn to purpose-built rentals. Like if you're renting long-term, you want some security. You do not want to be in a situation where you're kicked out every year or two, because this is when you start feeling the pressure of rents go up 20%. Because if you have to move out of your apartment every couple of years, you're paying market rents, right? If you move into a purpose-built rental apartment building today, and you're there for 5 to 10 years, your rent's only going up 1 to 2% per year, right? So you're not as impacted by this increase in rent prices, because in purpose-built rentals, you cannot really get kicked out very easily. And the rent increases are capped, right? Based on what the province sets. And that's usually not the case with condos. Condos, you can get kicked out if the investor wants to move into it or they want to sell it, or whatever. So again, it's a very personal decision. I would probably buy because I have a strong bias for ownership. Do you know what I mean? But again, and I like the idea that I'd be paying down my mortgage and I'm invested in an asset that I will own long term. But again, I think that would assume that I'd find a place that I'd be happy to live in for 5 years, or at least own for 5 years. And again, for some people, the concern is, the flexibility if I want to leave the country or something like that or move. I don't think that's as big of a concern, because at the end of the day, yes, you can still rent your apartment, you know what I mean, or your condominium, and still be invested and have that as just a longer term asset. So, relocation, moving out of the country, having that flexibility, especially if people are young, they want to have that flexibility in terms of finding jobs in other places. I don't think that's as big of a concern. I think the bigger concern is like the first example where I gave, where someone wants to move and buy a family home that's going to be more expensive in another market, and then that condo decision impacts them negatively, right? And I think that's what I would avoid. But in this case, if someone is holding it long term, or their concern is getting another job and they can just keep it as a rental, I think that's less of a concern, if that makes sense. I think that was a long answer to to a buy versus rent question.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of considerations, as Natasha points out, with rents climbing up over, in some cases, to $2,400 a month on average in Toronto area. So this is a situation that has become more pressing. I'm sure you're hearing a lot more from people now that are renting and thinking, whoa, that's a lot of money going up every month. And I guess the question that Natasha needs to ask herself is, when we say, can you stay in your place for 5 years? Can you live with that studio or one bedroom junior? Didn't sound like she was that excited about those sizes. So that's important to consider.
Yeah, 100%. And I think to her question about like where our price is going, I think generally, again, like most people are looking at what's going on and the key drivers, and the pressure on housing costs in Canada and in particular in Toronto are going to be pushing them up. Like, again, you cannot get away from the fact that our population is growing far more rapidly than our ability to build housing. And that's just going to continue to put pressure on house prices and rents. So, it's hard to avoid that. So it's a decision, where you want to be. You're going to be in a long-term rental, or you're going to be in an ownership. Now, the other thing I'll add is, and I'm not an accountant, so, take this with a grain of salt, and you might want to get independent advice. But regarding her question about, or comment about deducting the rent because she works from home, generally, as far as I understand, you can do that for houses. You know what I mean? It's the same principles apply. In the case of a home, you would be deducting effectively the costs of owning your home for that year. So rather than, you take 30% of your rent, you would take, say, 30% of your, interest, maintenance fees, property taxes, and say, listen, these are the costs of my home, and I'm going to deduct that on my taxes. So you can technically do both, but again, I would get some advice on that. But usually, in most cases, you can do that with houses as well.
Sounds good. And to the last part of Natasha's question about particular areas, like where you buy being important, what are your thoughts on that?
Again, I think that's highly personal. Again, there are areas with good value, again, like good value properties. But again, part of it is, if you don't drive, as I think she mentioned, and you need to be in Toronto, you want to look at buildings and locations that offer you good value. A lot of times, for example, older buildings might not be the prettiest, but they're usually less expensive. And you might get a little bit more square footage and space. And if that is what allows you to live in it longer term, I mean, I personally would sacrifice that. Like, I don't need the newest building with 10-foot ceilings and all of that. Again, I'd be more concerned about, the space, and is it enough for me to live in? So again, I think those are personal considerations in terms of, again, and part of it is, of course, her commute. If she's not driving, you want to live in a place that is connected enough and close enough to where you want to live. And I think that's actually a very important consideration, like the neighborhood and the community that you want to be a part of.
And in terms of appreciation for those condos, are you seeing it, like, obviously downtown Toronto has historically seen higher appreciations for condos. There was a bit of a shift with the COVID period. It looks like we're back to high demand now, climbing again in downtown areas. But is it true that population pressure that you're talking about would also apply across the GTA in many different areas, or if not across the GTA, in Natasha's case, across Toronto, because she's looking at Toronto proper?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing pressure on prices across the city of Toronto. But again, certain areas in the city are going to be performing a little bit better than others. But again, part of it is going to be, you don't want to buy for appreciation. You want to buy for, again, part of it is the community. So at least when we speak with our clients, the key is like thinking about what are the areas that they would want to live in, what are the potential neighborhoods based on their lifestyle, and then sort of the second question, okay, which ones might be a better long-term investment, and then drive our decision that way versus try to predict which area is going to do better, right? Because that's hard to predict. So it's better to focus on the 4 or 5 areas that you like the most, and then try to make some educated decisions about which ones might be a better investment. Because again, that's not perfect. We're just making informed decisions. So that's probably the best way to approach that.
Right. And I've heard you speak a lot. And one of the things to think about when you're saying emphasize your lifestyle and where you want to live, it's actually partly a financial decision, because you do hear from people who try to make that investment move and then really find they can't hack it in the area or the building or whatever they've chosen.
Yeah.
And so having to move before that 5-year mark then costs them in transaction.
100%. Exactly. I've seen people do this who they buy in an area, they don't like it, they don't like the community, they don't like, just the neighborhood, the vibe, the proximity to certain things. They just hadn't thought about that as much. And I think it is critical to think about it, because it actually has a material impact on your life, your lifestyle, where you walk out to, and, the community you're in. So I think it's huge.
Yeah, sometimes we're very optimistic about what we can live with when we see the numbers. All right, that's great. Thanks. I hope that helps, Natasha. Let's get to our last question. Hello, John. Hope you are keeping well. Your YouTube channel is really informative. I have a question and I will explain my situation. We are planning to buy a detached property in the Mississauga area around $1.3 million. We live in a house currently in Mississauga, currently valued at $850,000. I am planning to rent out this property and move to a detached if possible with my income and affordability. I have paid off this house, so I do not have a mortgage on it. It has a property tax of about $4,000 yearly. I'm planning to use equity from the current property for my down payment. With a family income of $200,000 yearly, zero debt, and a very good credit score, is it possible for me to purchase a $1.3 million detached property? Thanks, VJ.
Wow, this is a tricky one. So, okay, well, first off, thank you, VJ, and the other Natasha, Maria, for their feedback. I mean, appreciate the feedback, and people get value out of these segments. So thank you for that. So let's try to summarize VJ's question. So it currently lives in an $850,000 home, wants to upsize to a $1.3 million home. And wants to know if he could afford to keep the current home as a rental, right? Based on an income of $200,000, household income of $200,000. So put very simply, VJ is looking at taking on $1.3 million in debt if he wants to keep it, right? Because he has no additional savings. All of the capital he has is in the $850,000 townhome, which means he's taking on $1.3 million in debt, which is going to be spread between two properties, right? So is his income enough to qualify for $1.3 million in debt? Probably not. I mean, the simple rule is you can only borrow 4.5, maybe 5 times your income if you stretch it. But if you're renting your current home, the banks will include a portion of the rental income in their debt calculations in terms of figuring out how much debt you qualify for, right? And certain banks will, usually they're not going to include 100% of the expected rental income. They might use a percentage, 50, 60%, depending on the lender. So my instinct is it might be possible, depending on the lender that he works with. I suspect it will be possible. I think the key is to go to a good mortgage broker to understand exactly what banks and lenders are looking for. But, probably the numbers are very, very close. Now, the other consideration, of course, is, and I talk about this with a lot of people, is just because you can do something, does it mean you should do something or wants to do something? And again, I'm not going to give an opinion here because I'm very supportive of investing in real estate. I think what he's trying to do is good, but it's important to think about the numbers and how it impacts you in the future. So as an example, if he simply just sold his current home and bought a $1.3 million home, right? He'd be left with, let's just say roughly a $450,000 mortgage, okay? On his new home, because that's the difference between the price of what he's buying and what he's selling. Ignore transaction costs just to keep it simple. If he decides to keep the property as an investment, right, then his mortgage is probably going to go up to closer to about $850,000. Because he's going to have less capital to pull out of the existing home to use as a down payment. He's going to have to keep some of his money in his current home because he has to have some capital, and ideally enough so that he breaks even on those costs so that it's not draining him, right? And quite frankly, the more debt you have on that one, the better, because it's tax deductible. So in some ways, it's not bad to have it there. So what that means is he's going to basically have probably an extra $400,000 in mortgage debt on his principal residence that he's going to have to pay for. And that is going to cost him about, I don't know, anywhere from $2,000 to $2,500 a month, right? So the question here then is, I think the next question, the important one to think about is over the next 15 or 20 years, I think it's good to think like this and think, okay, I'm going to keep this home and as part of my retirement plan and as an investment strategy, as long as you're prepared to have this additional $2,000 a month payment on your principal residence, right? So his mortgage on his principal residence, if it was $450,000, he'd have a mortgage payment of, let's just say, $2,500 a month, right? Well, now if his mortgage is $850, that's going to go up to, say, $4,500 a month, right? So you need to think about that difference and say, okay, am I fine with that? Am I fine with having, close to $5,000 a month mortgage payment for the next 15, 20 years in order to have that investment property? And there's no right or wrong decision. I've had clients who obviously want to do that. They want to save, they want to have an investment. And I've had other clients who say, you know what, life's short. I don't, that extra $2,000 a month is like lifestyle spending. I can go on vacation. I can go on a golf trip. I can do whatever I want, to effectively consume it, to have like a more comfortable lifestyle, right? And that's what kind of some of these decisions are about. So I think that's the more important consideration, just thinking about long-term, how much debt you want to have and what you want your payments to be, and where you want that money going. So I think, to me, that's the more important consideration. I think the math will probably work based on his income. But again, going to a mortgage broker they'll kind of walk through the numbers in more detail with him.
Thanks. So it sounds like, VJ has to decide if that sacrifice would be worth it to try and hold on to that property as a long-term investment. It's maybe doable, but just. And so, that's the kind of personal decision you're looking at.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the tension a lot of people kind of face when they're making this is, again, we've been getting a lot more clients who want to do the exact same thing. They're moving, and I've written about this. This is actually one of the reasons why we're getting upward pressure on home prices, because most people don't want to sell their homes anymore, right? And they're converting them to rentals, right? And again, this in theory should decrease rental costs because we're increasing the supply and rental, but there's other reasons why rental prices are surging. So this isn't, but at the end of the day, when fewer people are selling their homes, there's going to be less homes available for sale. And this is one of the reasons why we're seeing so much price pressure, even right now in 2023 when rates are so high, because sellers aren't selling, right? So I think it is an important consideration when people are making this decision, because it's a long-term decision, right? It's not something you want to think about over the next 15 plus years, how you want to live your life and where you want your money invested.
And one final question, John, around the rent question in renting out an entire house in Mississauga. Have those rents stayed pretty relatively high or steady?
So yeah, rents for houses, we've seen upward pressure on them, certainly. Again, just like the whole housing market, again, I think for a lot of people who are getting priced out of the market are turning to single family home rentals. But again, if you do the math, like usually you have to have a pretty big down payment for you to kind of break even on those investments. So, but again, I think there is still pretty decent demand. Then you'd have to do the math to see what the potential rent is on an $850,000 home in Mississauga. And I think that's part of the important math that, he would need to think about to make sure he understands all of his costs.
Great. So that's our questions for today. There were some really, really good ones. Please keep them coming. John, do you want to share where people can send their questions? And if they have more specific concerns about their situation, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, they can send me an email anytime at askjohn@movesmartly.com, or to set up a consultation to go, over your questions in more detail. You can just go to movesmartly.com/meetjohn, or movesmartly.com/meetjohn is the
And
URL.
in those consults, do people get a little bit more idea about some of the questions that we were talking about, like, looking at renting out a house in Mississauga and what's going on?
I mean, those consultations are more specific for, potential clients who are looking at actually buying and selling, and then working through the scenarios. And like I said, in some cases, obviously we move forward and they look at buying a home or selling a home, but we're just kind of talking about all of the considerations in a little bit more detail. I mean, in some cases, like the first example I gave, they just don't end up buying because of the things that came up during our consultation. So that's really what kind of goes on when we meet up with potential clients.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone. And we'll look forward to answering more of your questions next month.